Greetings, everyone, and a very happy new year 2025. Thanks for joining us. And this is the Development Context of Sovereign Credit Ratings, a podcast by UNDP and Africa Catalyst. Now, this podcast is part of the UNDP Africa Catalyst Credit Ratings Initiative that is focused on supporting African countries navigate credit rating processes and be able to access affordable capital and finance their development. Our hope is that with this initiative, we're able to extend our coverage, but also be able to interact with different African countries, officials and governments and credit rating analysts and etc. to be able to support countries in accessing financing, which is very critical at this particular time. Now, today's topic is on South Africa's G20 presidency, which comes at a time when a lot of countries in Africa are servicing high debt obligations and high borrowing costs are also crowding out development spending and constraining their growth prospects. Now, although efforts are being made by multilateral development banks to lower the costs of their lending, experts have noted that credit rating agencies, especially the big three, should do more to ensure that sovereign credit ratings do not undermine global efforts to make development financing more affordable and accessible. We have to also understand that international market signals are really driven by these big three global credit rating agencies, which is S&P Global, Moody's, and Fitch Group, and they determine how much the cost of borrowing is, which essentially affects the development initiatives for countries, especially here in Africa. My hope is that at the end of this podcast, we'll be able to understand how South Africa will use its leadership at the G20 to push for changes in the global credit rating systems, but also how these changes can help reduce the cost of debt for developing countries. Obviously, at the end of the curve, we just want to see development financing more accessible and sustainable. I'm not alone today in studio. I'm joined by Daniel Cash, a credit rating research specialist. Daniel, thanks a lot for making time today, and a very happy New Year to you.
New Year to you too. Hopefully it was a restful one for you.
It was a very long holiday, but also really short. But I know it's a very long year, so much to look forward to. Yeah. So I just want to kick off with the fact that, Daniel, the high cost of capital in Africa is not just an African problem. It is a reflection of deeper structural challenges in global finance. And we've talked about the forms of the global financial system, architecture, etc., a conversation that is still ongoing. With South Africa now at the helm of the G20, where we also have G21, we have the AU. Why does this matter now, especially to the African continent? And what changes can we expect to see? Just give us an idea from where you see things.
So the South African presidency of the G20 is really an important step at a particularly important time. And it comes at the same time as another important event this year, which is the Financing for Development Conference 4, which is held in Spain this year in, I think it's July. And what we're seeing is that this year could be particularly important in terms of setting a pathway forward to address this development financing issue. The thing is to note is that we really need to be careful, though, to make sure that we understand what can happen and what will likely not happen. So recently I saw that people were writing in op-eds and what have you that South Africa has almost like a moral authority to make changes in this sense, and I think we should be more careful with that. What South Africa can do is keep driving the agenda, and that's really what the G20 is there for. So they are looking at a number of different pillars, and in terms of debt, they're looking at things like setting up, which we'll talk about later, the Cost of Capital Commission, and things like that. But what South Africa can really do is try to keep this issue at the forefront of the agenda and try to harness expertise so we get practical pathways forward rather than anything too grand, because the G20, after the COVID pandemic, almost got their fingers burned a little bit with the DSSI and Common Framework initiatives, which were trying to help the issue. but really compounded some of the problems. So I think it's a balancing act at the moment.
Yeah, but it's still exciting, because it's the first time an African, holding the leadership. But I would like for us to talk much more about the cost of capital commission. Like, what does it really entail? And how could it help tackle some of the issues that we have? And I know that when it comes to credit ratings, this is where a lot of people have been excited. Even with the op-eds you're talking about, I think one of the things that stands out is, the cost of capital commission. What is it going to do? And how is it going to run? Is it like a consortium of advisors? It's just a little bit somewhere in the air. And I think that's the excitement everyone really has.
Well, usually when there's a void, people like to fill it with ideas. So that's a good thing. That's where the excitement comes from. And to go back to your point before I address that, the point of us having a first African presidency is really important.
Yeah.
It really sets the scene for what's required. Even though the focus is on the developing world and developing markets, as it should be, Africa really needs a lot of focus at the moment. So having an African voice at the chair is really, really critical. So that being said, the Cost of Capital Commission hasn't had every detail played out yet. All we have so far is a commitment from the presidency to initiate the commission. And essentially, they want to look at making things like amendments to credit rating methodologies, prudential regulation, data needs. And what they're trying to do is harness and bring a lot of experts together to focus on particular problems so that they can then advise outside of any political structure, particular solutions. And we can talk about the credit rating specific solutions if you'd like.
Yeah. Then I just still on that. I'm just looking at the priorities. Just to reiterate what you've mentioned, we're looking at the IFA reforms, addressing the high debt situation, promoting infrastructure investments, and reforming international taxation systems, and financial flows. So we literally they are focused more on financing, which is a very good thing. But one would argue that this is quite ambitious, even though it's a timely agenda. It's quite ambitious for South Africa. It might need probably some technical, financial, even moral support to be able to achieve this. Talk to me about your sense of that. What are some of the immediate things that you foresee, or even your optimism?
Yeah, well, people usually don't come to me for optimism, Maggie. You should know that by now. But the good thing is that there is a bit of a template to follow here, and a lot of enthusiasm has been derived from how the G20 have approached multilateral development bank reform, MDB reform. And over a period of 2 to 3 presidencies, starting with the Italian presidency, the G20 have really focused on MDB reform to a point where we've had a decent amount of structural reform. And what people are suggesting is that that same model can be applied to the larger financing sector. So what the suggestion is for the South African presidency is that its mission here is really to start a chain reaction. The future G20 presidencies can pick up the baton and run with, which is what happened in the last few, where Indonesia and Brazil carried the baton for MDB reform. So the question here is whether South Africa can lay the foundations strongly enough to start this process, because the reality is, and something we must address, all of those things that you've just mentioned, which are critical elements, you can't fix in 12 months. There are structural issues that take a long time to impact. And if that's the case, then you have to take a back step and try to strategize best how you do that. And one of the best ways may be to pick incremental targets. And one thing I would say for the South African delegate is the aim is to set the foundation and to allow room, a fertile foundation for growth.
When you say set the foundation, it's more like set the agenda. It doesn't, if there isn't as much impact, this can be continued by the next presidency. So what about if the next leadership has a different priority?
Well, that's what I'm saying. One of the aims for the South African mission surely should be to incentivize the next presidency to show that this is critical.
Yeah.
And you do that by, one, making sure that the right people are in place, which is one of the most important issues that they face. So they have to have a delicate balance of, you need very established people and entities, but you can't have the same old faces, because that's how we ended up in this problem in the first place. So you have to have a good mix of people who are visionary, people who are new in their thinking, but also people who are established. And if you get a good blended team, that will help future iterations. But also, it needs to be made clear through the initial aspects of the commission that this is the right way to do things. And that's not for me to suggest or for you to suggest, that's for the commission to almost justify its own existence. And if that can be done, then future presidencies will be likely to take it on board.
That's a good way to look at it. Daniel, it's quite interesting and also exciting. When you think about it, at the same time, we have the African Union as a member, the G21. Does that add a certain advantage to South Africa really pushing its agenda?
I think so, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, it is the global south/developing world issue, but Africa does seem to experience things in a very unique manner. And I think what's vital in every different aspect, and I've researched and called for this in other aspects in the credit ratings sector, but we really need more African voices on the global stage. And by doing this, what you do is you increase the representation on that level, which increases the chances of a more impactful solution or set of solutions coming out. So I think the more harmony we can get in terms of, one, calling for change, but two, being on the same team when we're actually trying to implement that change, that's where the key is.
What kind of impacts are we looking at? Could these reforms, be, for example, advanced? What kind of impact do they have on the cost of debt for countries in Africa and other developing economies?
Well, it's difficult because on the one hand, let's say my pessimistic shoulder tells me they are approaching a very systemic problem.
Yeah.
And the problem doesn't negatively impact everybody. There are quite a few actors who are positively impacted by this problem. And I think of like the split between the global north and the global south. So for that sense, you have that to fight against. But on the other side, the positive shoulder tells me that the only people who can change this really are in the G20, the likes of the United Kingdom, the United States, the European Union, because these are global north institutions that we're trying to change. They're not global south institutions. So if they're global north institutions, you have to have the global north at the table. Now, the problem comes where you have to incentivize the global north to change, and that's where we're a current impasse. Because, for example, very quickly, to change the credit rating impasse that I've spoken about, you need legal changes in particular jurisdictions in the US and in the European Union. Now, you have to have them at the table in order to even have the possibility of change. So in that sense, it's a positive that the G20 are potentially the vehicle for this change. It's another question of whether that change will happen. I wouldn't like to predict that, Maggie, but the potential is there if they are at the table, and by design, they are in the G20, so they are at the table.
It's such a good question to leave out there, Daniel, because we know credit ratings where the changes need to happen, but it's a question of, like you said, legalities, policy, and with these other bigger nations. So clearly, it's not that you're going to see the changes just now, but it's a step towards advocacy of probably what needs to change. And I think it brings me to what you said in the beginning. We have to set the foundation that can be built on. And I love you've done a lot of advocacy around the credit ratings and research that justifies lots of recommendations that probably needs to support our countries access financing. But now it's really very critical. Talk to us about the collaboration needed between South Africa, the G20, and the IMF, the World Bank, and even other key international players to achieve these reforms. Because when you talk about countries like the US or the United Kingdom, I mean, even with financial reforms, it's still a question of many years of advocacy, but not as much change that has happened. What kind of collaboration is really needed to see a little teeny bit?
Well, It's difficult because it seems to me every time I've read everything about South Africa's presidency, a lot of people's enthusiasm is actually creating a lot of pressure. So there's a lot of pressure on South Africa to act and to do things, which I think is quite unfair. What I would say is, I mean, I presume South Africans are used to it. But I think the reality is what they can do, which is exactly what they're doing, for example, with the Cost of Capital Commission, is that the people who need to act need to be in the room, and you need to be very clear and decisive with who that is. I think the time is well past for like discussions and let's have a debate about things. It's now time to put people in a room and say we need to get to a solution. Let's pick a strategy that we can then start implementing. And I think that a lot of what the South African presidency has suggested is very decisive, which is a good thing, because it's not about, yes, let's say the detail for the Cost of Capital Commission isn't there yet, but it's very clear that the commission will be set up. It's very clear that the commission will be aiming for very particular things, and that's a good thing. So I think when you're collaborating, you really need a clear structure and how different parties participate in the structure. And I feel like that is there this year, and hopefully future presidencies continue that approach.
I feel like South Africa really needs a lot of support in technical sports. It probably brings in a lot of research and expertise, even with the commission we've talked about. But Daniel, you were saying earlier on that, this is something that, this is work that can be continued by the next presidency. But it's not the first time a country from the global south is taking on leadership. I mean, we've had Brazil in Asia, and we've drawn from their leadership a lot. I think for me, why we're even having this conversation is that there is an opportunity to advocate for fairer credit ratings through South Africa's presidency. But this is something that could have even been done with the last two, for example, leadership that we've had at the helm. What practical steps need to happen, and what is different this time around? Are there any potential challenges or resistance you see?
So look, the previous presidencies had different factors affecting their approach. So, for example, MDB reform was right at the top of the agenda. And now that's sort of died away because they've had some positive outcomes. I think what that does, though, is it provides South Africa with a lot of support in the fact that it was possible to have an aim, to have an objective, and to see a clear outcome. And I think that should encourage the South African delegates to really focus on this. I think one thing that comes to my mind from what I've seen in the past year, though, is that I don't envy the South African presidency, because I've been to a number of organizations who are seeking to support the South African presidency, but they're all doing different things at the same time. And it would almost be like, as what we say in the UK, like herding cats, because you have so many different organizations trying to help in different ways. So the practical steps that could happen is that more entities get put into the same room. And I know I keep saying that, but even at the multilateral level, where you have the likes of, let's say, different UN departments, the OECD, different elements who are providing support, but in different manners, and all trying to seek to provide support in their way. The critical thing is that the focus here on the cost of capital is useful because it's a really clear objective: reduce the cost of capital. What I would say is, though, that there really needs to be a focus on the realities of what we're dealing with rather than the things that we like to focus on. So, for example, we have to be very delicate and careful, but when we're looking at the cost of capital, that is not just a finance problem, in terms of you have things like a lot of countries need to be better with their data and their collection of data and their dissemination of data. And when you say that, I feel uneasy saying it, because it looks like it's a lot of almost like victim blaming, because the countries are the one who are suffering. But the countries do have a role just as much as the credit rating agencies, just as much as the investment banks. and the countries need help. And I think a lot of focus really needs to be injected into something I'm passionate about, which is capacity building. And I think for the likes of the G20, sometimes they try to go too high level because they're seeking to make change on a systemic level. And my argument would be that actually the force of the G20 at the country level, in terms of like capacity building and building initiatives that can be sustainable, that could be even more impactful. Because one thing I'm known for advocating in the credit rating space is that countries really should be pushing, and we all should be pushing, not for better credit ratings, but for fairer credit ratings. And they're very different, because to get better credit ratings, not everybody can be AAA. That's not how it works. But everybody should be able to expect a fairer credit rating process. And in that fairer credit rating process, countries themselves have things that they can contribute, like better data sharing, better organization, better capacity. And then we focus on the credit rating agencies who themselves could have more transparent methodological processes, better representation on the ground in Africa, XYZ. And everybody has a role to play. But I think if we go too high level, we're going to miss critical components underneath that are the critical foundation. So that would be my advice, for what it's worth, to the G20.
That's really very enlightening, Daniel. And I think, probably that's one of the things we need to be very careful with, because we are looking at it from the G20 point of view. Okay, so if we're able to advocate and we have these changes and we don't have the capacity to really even be able to provide the data, we will still have the problems. We will still, not be able to meet the merits, or, the processes. We'll still not be able to do that. And for me, it brings me to why we have organization and the UNDP Africa Catalyst Credit Ratings Initiative. We've engaged a lot with government officials who have, said things like, I had no idea is what I needed to do to be able to get a fair rating, or I had no idea this is what I expected from the analyst. I didn't know how to speak to the analyst or to engage. And for me, I think it's very important to really talk about capacity building, especially in African countries, not even just for credit ratings, but for a whole lot of advocacy we're doing around financing. Like, how do we access cheap, affordable financing to be able to finance development? So for me, that's really a very good takeaway. And I think it's something that even the audience can draw from. So from where you sit, Daniel, as we wind up, I want to look at some of the recommendations. So you really think, and I would love to think that maybe that's what the cost of capital commission is going to be about, really addressing some of these things from a country level, no? That's what I would think.
We would hope so, but I mean, time will tell, because it comes down to who's on that commission. Because I'm not saying what I've just said is the correct and only way, but not everybody thinks like that. Somebody might take a different approach, and it has to be a very delicate blend. I think, look, I mean, you know me well, and I was involved in the credit rating initiative, as you know. For me, capacity building is my passion, and that's what I think is the most important part, because a lot of realities go under the radar here. We're dealing with African countries who are relatively very young countries. A lot of countries gained their independence in the 60s. That's not a long time at all. In terms of issuing Euro bonds, they're much younger still. A lot of countries have only issued Euro bonds for 10, 20 years. Not every country is as mature as South Africa on the continent. And that lack of experience is not their fault, but it's something that we must address, and it's something that we can manufacture against. Like the initiative that you mentioned between UNDP and Africa Catalyst is an example of manufacturing capacity building. It's as easy as that. You put the right people in the room, you strategize the right way, you take what I promote as a assume nothing approach. You assume that the person you're dealing with doesn't have the skills. You don't judge on that basis, but you build on that basis. And the next thing you know, simple mistakes that happen that affect the process are eliminated. And then if you can build that and sustain that and extrapolate that, next thing you know, you have a network of systems that are raised from the floor up. And I think that's where we need to be. There's a lot of realities on the African continent that are difficult to address. Like in one of my books, I had a whole chapter or two on the colonial history that is in the continent, and we have to address that because that's part of the history, it's part of the story. But what that effect has then is that when you're building systems, you have to build systems in a particular manner. And I think that's what the Cost of Capital Commission would do well to do, is take a step back, try not to find a very quick headline win, and take a systems approach to how can we look at our systems that we have, where can we build it, and where can we develop it without stripping the African culture, the African flavour, the African approach, because Africa must be built in Africa's vision. It must be an African future rather than a European future applied to it or an American future applied to it. It has to be an African first approach. So it's difficult to find that balance, but it's definitely possible. And being involved with the initiative as well as I have, that it's very quick, easy and rewarding to initiate this capacity building because you see change very quickly. And just sometimes people need a little bit of help, and that's fine. And that's what the system should be about, really.
Absolutely. And I've seen it firsthand, even with some of the seminars and workshops we've had, where you have like practical sessions between ex-analysts and government officials. And you can clearly tell, there's so much learning to do, but they're clearly putting their issues out, and it's things that they had no idea about. And having these at the level of G20, I think doesn't solve as much as you've said. But we're going to remain optimistic. Daniel, we're running out of time. I really want to say a huge thank you and leave this, just highlight some of the few things you've mentioned. So for me, it's really very critical that we understand that South Africa's G20 presidency is really about setting the foundation. Now, there's been a lot of advocacy that has been done, but having the next presidency or, having the foundation set is very important because it determines what the future might look like. We're not sure if the changes might take 60 years, 40 or 50 or 30, but setting a foundation is very, very, very critical. And obviously, we shouldn't get as much excited about South Africa. There's a lot that, is needed from technical support, financial support, a whole lot of things to be able to get the impact, especially across Africa, and critical as well is capacity building, especially when it comes to credit ratings. Not just a good rating, but a fair rating. And that's the takeaway for me. And I hope we have another conversation to delve deeper into the ratings themselves. But it was really good to understand to what extent do we expect reforms to push for rating reforms from South Africa's presidency. And I think that has given us an idea. And we will build on to that and bring you back, obviously, for another conversation. Daniel, thank you so much for making time.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you. And to the listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Maggie Mutesi. You can find this podcast on Spotify and YouTube, but also on the UNDP Africa website, also on the Africa At Least website. On Spotify, it's the development context of sovereign credit ratings. And you can be able to listen to all the episodes, previous episodes we've had, Daniel's episode, and we hope you enjoy it. I wish you a very good evening, good day, and good morning. Thank you.